Now, the last piece of this, remember how much anxiety drives us and our behavior, and how few markers it leaves, so that we tend to be very unaware of it, unless we're in a situation like we're going to get up and make a speech, and then we're extremely anxious, and then we're aware of it. But so much of this is operating so under the surface that we're not particularly aware of it, which makes it even more sinister in that regard, because we like to think of ourselves as free agents and making all these decisions according to the best available data and yada, yada, yada. And in fact, that is usually not occurring. We are, and again, the less well-defined you are, the less you are making well-informed, reasonable decisions, and the more you are responding to unconscious forces, especially anxiety forces, that are driving your behavior. Okay? And this is happening to all of us. I'm not saying this happened to just one or two people, but it's happening on a continuum too. In other words, anxiety is driving us to a greater or lesser degree, and it will be driving you to a greater degree the less aware you are. Like the red zone. You will be making decisions or fighting out your conflicts more in the red zone the less aware you are of it, especially if that theme is extremely prominent to you. Let's say you came from a very, very abusive family and survival is very, very prominent to you, and the fact that you really can't trust people because they will get you, especially if they get close to you, that's going to be running your behavior a lot more than you realize and informing your decisions, as opposed to good, solid decisions that is based on information that makes sense. That's where all this becomes very, very important, because what I find is so many of the people that I know and I work with or whatnot are running around making all kinds of decisions, will tell you, because again, internally they've told themselves a lie, all the rationale behind the decision, when in fact it was more driven by anxiety than it had anything to do with the facts that presented themselves in that particular situation. That's where this is important. So we have, what am I committed to? But then how do I sabotage myself in bringing about that commitment? And then what's the competing value that informs that sabotaging behavior? And the last piece of this, by the way, which creates a whole lot of anxiety too. Remember I said the status quo and the lack of it creates anxiety, for sure. The losses generated by my decision creates anxiety. So does what we call this big assumption. The big assumption is some totally irrational catastrophe that'll happen if this were to occur. Let me give you my own example, because I'm an acceptance person. So let's say I say to I am committed to challenging people on their behavior to do the right thing, even if it distresses them and disappoints them. Okay, that's my commitment. But my behavior says that when I should confront somebody about their behavior, I in fact pull punches. I don't say it, or I make nice, or I say it and then backpedal immediately from what I said. I didn't really mean it, or it isn't as bad as I said it was, or whatnot. The competing value that's driving that is my acceptance, which says, Jim, if you say that to this person, they may reject you and won't accept you. That's a real bad thing. What's the big assumption that lies behind that? The big assumption is, if they don't accept me, they may abandon me. And if they abandon me, I'll die. I will not live any longer. That's the way these big assumptions work. As you notice, by the way, it makes no sense whatsoever. But it's very powerful, because if it lacks any kind of reasonable mediation, it becomes truth to me. In other words, it's emerging from this emotional part of my brain where my story is kept, where in many ways I'll act like a child. In fact, some psychologists in popular places call it the inner child. And the reasoning is much more like a child reasoning, okay? where a child, if the child is abandoned by important people to them, they will stop existing. But not when you're 45 or 55 or 65. That's not true. But these assumptions, again, operate outside of our awareness, number one, and out of our reasonableness, or out of the frontal lobes of our brain, where we think like an adult and can say, does that make any sense? No, that makes no sense at all. That doesn't have any correspondence to reality. So that's where this becomes very, very important to understand how this works. With what am I committed to? How do I sabotage myself? What competing value is driving my sabotage? And is there a big assumption that's totally non-rational, but that is there? Such as a competence big assumption. Gee, if I don't do this absolutely perfectly, and if it's not done to this incredible standard, then I will be judged incompetent, and because competence is linked to love, I will become unlovable. That could be a big assumption, in other words, that's there, that drives people to these perfectionist places. And I've worked a lot with perfectionist folks, you know, and it's totally irrational that they feel that there's some big catastrophe that's going to befall them. And one way, by the way, in your slides here, you'll see there's a little graph there, how my story unfolds. And what I do there is I turn it backwards so that you think, okay, what is the big assumption that may be driving the competing value that causes me to do the very things of sabotage that I say I am committed to, such like the priesthood of believers, but I'm constantly over-controlling everybody. And when I try to give them control of the situation, all of a sudden I'm back in control myself. And the big assumption is if I give them control, I'll lose control, which means they'll take over and the whole situation and the whole institution will collapse and I'll be left with nothing. Something along that line that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but because it's not mediated by your intellectual, your adult parts of your brain, it becomes incredibly energized for people in doing that, okay? So the big assumption tied together with the sense of loss, if I do give you the priesthood of believers, let's say, I'm going to lose my own control or my own position here or whatnot, coupled with our brains don't like the unfamiliar anyway, you can see then why we tend to sabotage the very changes that we say we want to bring about. But just be aware that if you say you want this and then do another thing, what happens? You're misaligned, you're not well defined, you don't build trust, and people will not follow you. So I just want you to keep in mind how these things follow one on the other. And now we're into change, and all of us would say we want change. Ministers, of course, want change. We don't want to leave the status quo. We say the status quo is evil in a lot of ways. So we want to bring about change. I just want you to be aware of how you may sabotage that. I want to build a bigger church, but now I'm going to sabotage that. I want to have my people more exercising their gifts, but I sabotage that. Whatever it is, I just want you to be aware of that, how this process is working internally so that you can bring it to awareness then and start being able to make the adjustments that are proper.